Thank you very much for being here. I am very excited to kick off our first panel of the day. I am Isa Ding. I'm an associate professor in political science at Northwestern University. We have three speakers. One joining online to my left is Andrés Arauz, former Minister of Knowledge of Ecuador, who will be sharing with us knowledge about green industrial policy in Latin America. And then we have Liliana Doganova, who is a sociologist at Paris, PSL University, and she will be speaking about how the logics of capitalization shape our relationship with the future. And then lastly, we have Kohei Saito, a philosopher superstar from Japan, whose work on degrowth has made huge splash both domestically and internationally, and he will be talking to us about communism, degrowth, and climate change. So without further ado, so we have 2 hours total. Each speaker will talk for under 30 minutes. I will send a signal when it's 25, and then we will welcome the audience to join us with questions. Okay, so I'm gonna hand the floor to Andrés.
Thank you, Isa. Thank you, the Remarque Institute, for the invitation. Thank you for being here, despite being at a nice Saturday morning. And I'd like to talk about a few things before we get into procurement clubs and green industrial policy, because after listening all day yesterday on the perspectives of climate, democracy, and power, I thought it would be important to contribute with a perspective from the global South, Latin America, and from a practical and empirical perspective of what these issues have meant for us. As part of my different jobs that I used to have in the Ecuadorian government, one of them that was my second favorite job title was Deputy Secretary for Planning of the Good Life. It was under the planning ministry, and I was the Deputy Secretary of the Good Life, and that's how we start this talk, because the previous job title for that position was Deputy Secretary for Planning of Development. And we had a paradigmatic conversation after our 2008 constitution was, what is development? Do we want to develop? Who do we want to emulate? Who do we want to replicate? What type of society do we want to live? Do we just want to replicate industrial development with the capitalist parameters, or do we want something else? And we decided we wanted something else as a society, and our constitution says that our utopia, our horizon, is the good life. In Spanish, buen vivir. And buen vivir is a paradigm that comes from many traditions, mostly Andean and Amazonian indigenous peoples, but that we can translate to, if you want to put it in terms of international law, the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, add environmental to that, or like our own constitutional chapter calls them the rights of buen vivir. So when my job was to plan for the good life, or buen vivir, it meant that we needed, as Clement said yesterday, a needs-based, but also a human rights-based planning system. How do you get to fulfill the enjoyment of human rights of every member of society and of society as a whole, not just of individual people, but of this more collective principle? Of course, that means that you can't leave everything to the market, you can't leave everything to individual initiative, you can't leave everything to the private sector. Of course, you need a strong collective action, which requires the role of the state, but also the role of society itself, both in terms of territorial organization, sectoral organization, and ways of creating networks of representation to make that happen. And we said, okay, we have to plan this with participation, with decentralization, with distribution of tasks and roles, but it has to be necessarily long-term planning, right? Even if the government administration only lasts 4 years, the presidential period, 4 years, you really can't get anything done in 4 years. So you need to plan prospectively. And that means you need to do long-term planning. And when you do long-term planning, and here's part of where I want to insist a lot today, you start to zoom out and to realize that if you want to plan with monetary metrics, you will absolutely fall short of any transformative change. You have to abandon monetary metrics to do long-term planning. If anything, monetary metrics should be the final consequence and step that has to be institutionally resolved of what you want to build as a society. But if we are trying to plan based on my budget constraint measured in these, fictitious instruments of society called, dollars or whatever, then you're basically condemning yourself. You're limiting yourself to managing the juncture and the very, very, very short term, and falling under the pressures of speculative capital and so forth. So we decided that if we want to talk about the good life or buen vivir, or living well, we need new metric. We need a new way of measuring the advancement of society. We need a new way of defining if we are doing well or not, and so forth. And a big chapter in our development plan was called La Nueva Métrica para Buen Vivir, the new ways of measuring the good life. And of course, there was a catalog of human rights. So we went through all the international treaties that we had signed. We went through our constitution, and we made a catalog of all the human rights that are listed there. And we said, okay, this is our metric. Are we getting closer to the realization, the fulfillment of the human rights or not? And then we said, but it's not just enough to say, oh yeah, we're doing a good job in terms of health or education access and so forth. We need the material base to make this actually happen. So as a poor, developing country that's low in the international hierarchy of power and so forth, we needed to have a very strong emphasis on material transformation, so productive transformation. We need to actually have a very strong and coherent economic and industrial policy that makes the fulfillment and the enjoyment of human rights actually possible. And the metric that we were very attracted to is what we call biophysical planning. So basically seeking the coherence between the different elements of real variables, not fake real or monetary real, like GDP, but real, joules, hectares, kilometers squared, cubic meters, and real variables that would then those be the actual physical constraints of our plans for a good living. And one of the things that we learned in this process was that there already had been a ton of work for the alternative metrics of this relationship between humans or among humans and between humans and nature, which is the United Nations Statistical Division excellent work on the system of environmental and economic accounts, which is little known, but is absolutely crucial if we want to truly transition from a world dominated by financial capital to one where we can agree on material well-being for all based on real real life. So the system of environmental economic accounts includes accounting and the relationship between flows of water, energy use, land use, material goods, minerals, and so forth. And of course, it's a much better system for long-term planning than just trying to do some funky simulations with GDP and so forth, right? But then we said, okay, this is what we want. This is how we want to make, this is our goal. These are our standards where we want to achieve, that we want to achieve in the long term, in the medium term. But now, how do we pay for this? And in our case, unlike hard currency issuing countries like the United States, like the Eurozone as a whole, like the UK and others, for us, it is an actual restriction, right? For us, it is about an issue of lack of money. And it is an issue about where do I get the funding to make this actually happen? How do I take on credit and how can I create means of payment to make this happen? So we had to interact between our long-term biophysical planning and our balance of payments planning. And that's when we started to really find the most profound contradictions of the Ancien regime, the current international trade system, and how capitalism, how bio-ignorant capitalism has been codified into international public law. So if you try to say, we want to avoid imports of luxury cars because we want to save those few dollars, we're actually building energy sovereignty, that's illegal under international law. Can't do that. That's called an import restriction. And you get busted by the WTO. And if it's not WTO, then you get retaliation. And it's legitimized retaliation from trade partners. But I'm just prioritizing my very scarce resources, monetary resources. No, that's just not allowed. It is just not allowed to do it. It's forbidden to do that under international law. But what if I want to regulate the mining companies so that they have performance requirements and standards in terms of ethical treatment of their workers, but also environmental regulations? Oh, well, those weren't around when the mining contract was signed 20 years ago. So if you do that, and the company feels that they have been unjustly treated, well, they'll sue you in the arbitration courts at the World Bank, at the ICSID, or the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And then the country has to use billions of dollars to compensate the mining companies for, oh, how dare you regulate? And then we were under constant threat of transnational corporations just for daring to try to execute your plan from going from A to B to aspiring to a little bit better situation in terms of approaching that paradigm of MBB. So then we had to navigate these real life restrictions for a developing country that have to do with scarcity in terms of balance of payments, but also with bio-ignorant capitalism codified in international law. Now, at a national level for a country like ours, money scarcity is a real issue. But if you think about it, it is not an issue as a planet. It's not a global, how can money scarcity be an issue if you take the planet as a whole? Right? It is just an internal, socially defined institution, right? Money is not in nature. Money is not part of our physical world. Money is a social institution that is created by us for coordination. Therefore, it can be resolved institutionally. social coordination, so that we can finance our way to the transition that we aspire to collectively. And there are examples, and I really like a statement that in September 2001, the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, who, by the way, is an environmental economist, she wrote an op-ed in CNBC, and yeah, just precisely 3 years ago, where after the biggest issuance of special drawing rights in 2021 of 650 billion worth, $650 billion worth of special drawing rights, which is akin to an international currency issued by the IMF, National Monetary Fund. She said there's no such thing as scarcity of money for our climate green transition. Now, 2 weeks after she said that, they tried to remove her from her post from the IMF, and it was really a strong coup attempt against Georgieva for daring to say that. But what she was saying was, you know, we as a society and we as a planet and we as an international community really can create as much money as we want if we want to do it. If there's the political will to do it, we can do it. And SDRs are created ex nihilo, out of thin air. And it's not dollars, it's not budget, it's not deficit. It's an international reserve currency that is allocated to all the countries in the world. Now, of course, we can solve this in terms of access to finance. Problem is, they're trying to push us to live in the paradigm of financial capital where the few people have the power to define the priorities of society and not defining these collective instruments to transition from A to B in the case of our necessary green transition. Another issue that we found when we did this Buen Vivir planning was that we were facing a growing, what we call the new international division of labor, where countries of the South were becoming provider of green global public goods, mainly oxygen, but also natural resources like minerals and biodiversity. But there was no way to institutionally enclose them. So they were natural public goods that, you can't put a tariff on oxygen when they crosses borders. But the global North was becoming a provider of knowledge, which in natural terms should be a global public good. However, we did find as a society, a capitalist society, ways to enclose knowledge with legal mechanisms so that it becomes a private good and it becomes therefore tradable and subject to the rules of capitalism, private property. So how come society can come up with institutions to enclose knowledge, but no institutions to enclose the provision of global public goods that mainly come from the global South? And so when the pandemic happened, we saw how this perverse system went into play in real life. When many countries in Latin America and Africa got the vaccine almost a year later because of the enclosure of knowledge, not just supply chains and so on, because we're not allowed to produce it because you didn't pay the royalties or you didn't have the license to make the vaccine and so forth. And that's in the case of patents that at least the knowledge is published somewhere, it's available, but increasingly the patent system, which has its pros and cons, but has been, I think, in general, a contribution to society in the sense that at least the information is out there for anyone to copy and even improve. But now most of what we are seeing is that knowledge is enclosed in trade secrets. And we've had an evolution of the legislation of trade secrets in the past decade or so. The hardest, more stringent enclosure of trade secrets happened during the Obama administration in the United States, where now they have very, very, very high protections from the state if they are divulged or revealed or whatever, and that knowledge doesn't doesn't flow to other potential producers, makers, innovators, and so on. And so what I think we need, and this is part of what I think should be discussed in any green transition, is that we need full disclosure of trade secrets of life-saving and planet-saving technologies. And if necessary, even set up a whistleblower program for those daring to reveal those trade secrets of the technology required for the acceleration of that transition, because it's an issue of an emergency. So when you have emergency, you're allowed to suspend the effects of certain laws because you're in an emergency. And in this case, the climate and the climate emergency requires for that full disclosure of trade secrets and flexibility in terms of patents, so that these technologies become a global public good and can be applied for and by everyone in the planet for that transition. Why is it that renewable energy technology is enclosed when it should be obviously openly available to accelerate their transition? And this, of course, is not something that I'm coming up with right now. This is one of the main discussions in the conference of the parties of the climate summits and so on, when the developing world says, we need technology transfer, right? And of course, that sounds sort of abstract. What we're saying is, hey, give me the recipes, share your recipe with me. I want to be able to make that cookie too. Mm-hmm. Now, like I was saying, bioignorant capitalism is codified in international law. If you read the General Agreement of Trades and Tariffs, which then became the WTO, that thing was written up in like the 40s, right? And of course, the issue of the climate emergency or the green transition was definitely not a priority in the 40s, yet that is the law of the land in the planet right now. So we need a reread of international law. We need a reread of the free trade agreements. We need a reread of the bilateral investment treaties and all of the regime that's derived from that, to say, okay, we really need to rethink about this in terms of the climate transition, and especially in terms of giving opportunities for the people of the global south. One of the first steps that we need to do is get rid of investor-state dispute settlement. You cannot have entire states be subordinated to transnational capital if there is any sort of regulation. And surprisingly, the European Union has taken bold steps in that direction, both in terms of intra-EU treaties, but also by collectively leaving the Energy Charter Treaty, which is basically this one-way blank check for big oil to sue states that don't like regulation. But when a global south country says, hey, me too, yeah, I want to leave that. Oh, no, you can't leave that. So the north-south bilateral investment treaties that give privileges to big oil from the north and the south, those cannot be terminated. But the investment treaties among the countries of the global north, they have been terminated. What's this? this is glaring hypocrisy and is creating a segregation of permissible climate transition in the north, but forbidden climate transition. So to have this discussion, we need a different framework. And I and some others have called this, of course, there's the longer tradition, but international political ecology. Right? So the political economy of the international green discussions around the world, and how they are intertwined with the current international system. Now, yesterday I was listening and paying attention to all these initiatives in terms of technologies for the transition, and of course, every time I hear the word, a solar panel or electric vehicle, what comes to my mind is, okay, that's about 3 more open pit mines in the middle of the Amazon, because for every solar panel, you need a bunch of minerals, and those minerals, where are they going to come from? What's the material base for the green transition, for the energy transition, for the renewables? And in the case of electric vehicles, a standard electric vehicle has approximately 30 more times of copper than what you have in a regular fossil-based car. Okay, now multiply that times, whatever, how many cars we want to replace. Where's all that copper going to come from? Yeah. And of course, that means, what is the role of the global south again as a provider of the natural resources and the minerals for this energy transition? Is there that conversation happening right now around the world? Besides the fact that the Pentagon is pushing for the critical minerals initiative and saying, we want to make sure that the supply keeps flowing. I think we need to have a better discussion. We need to have a discussion where the providers of the raw materials can actually find the opportunities to participate in the development of this transition in terms of achieving their own development objectives as well, in terms of improving their industrial base, in terms of value added, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of knowledge transfer, in terms of making sure that people don't have to leave their own communities, that they have something to aspire to in the future that doesn't involve migrating again. So when we hear, and yesterday was mentioned, for example, reshoring or the relocalization, does that also include the extractive component? Are we also going to reshore all the extractive mines? I don't think so, right? So then why don't we discuss reshoring from a global south perspective, which is, why don't you set up your factory down here? Why don't we create job opportunities here? And then let's talk and let's trade, right? So I have 5 minutes left, and those 5 minutes hopefully will be enough to now get into the very specific component of clubs. But all this was very necessary to lay the groundwork for what comes next, right? One of the initiatives that we had when we were the Korean government was a joint a paper written by Herman Daly and Rafael Correa, then the president, on an OPEC tax on crude oil. OPEC tax on crude oil. Right? So we're talking about the climate transition and the climate emergency. Back then, it wasn't called like that. It was something else. Fine, let's make oil more expensive, and let's have OPEC the club of oil exporters charge a tax for every barrel of oil so that it can go to a fund for financing climate initiatives and so forth. Of course, that was rejected by everyone because it meant increasing the market power in the energy sector of the oil exporting countries. But let's think about the same concept but applied to the reality of the energy transition, which is happening at an accelerated pace right now. What would be the reaction of the global north if the countries in Africa and Latin America tomorrow said, oh, you know what, we're coming up with a minerals cartel. And if you want to get the critical minerals, you don't have to negotiate with each company or with each country individually. You got to talk to the OMEC, Organization of Mineral Exporting Countries. That could probably be casus belli in this case, right? So why? If the aspiration of the countries and the states and the governments and the peoples of the global south is to have just a little bit more fair conditions in terms of this energy transition, where it's not just about improving prices, which is already a lot, but that the new cartelization or the new clubs for the provision of these critical goods and minerals for the energy transition would make way for industrial transformation. So if OPEC in the past was just basically focused on price, now a potential organization of mineral exporting countries can say, no, it's not just about price. It's about standards, performance requirements, environmental regulation, opportunities for the communities, industrialization of these minerals, where they come from, so that there are more opportunities for the peoples of the global south. Of course, that hasn't gotten far, but what has happened is the creation of a cartel of mineral buyers. The United States and Western European countries have, well, not just Western European, now the EU and the United States mainly, but I think also a few other countries have created a club that they call the Buyers Club, the Critical Minerals Buyers Club. And now they are setting the standards so that they can have more market power when it comes to negotiating with the countries of the global south, as if they didn't have enough market power already. And so the reality is that we're living this asymmetric world when, of course, the countries that are undergoing the energy transition now have their own buyers club for critical minerals, but the countries in the global south do not have this collective instrument that would improve their conditions. That is what we want to do now. That is what several of us in the global south are working on, trying to build this coalition. Very difficult because there's not enough technical knowledge, there's not enough understanding of the market dynamics, there's not enough vision of where we want to reach, but this is absolutely necessary. And we have a few precedents of things similar that have happened in the region. You know, in the 60s and the 70s, we had a banana exporting club in the 60s and the 70s. That was shut down by the big transnational corporations like United Fruit and Standard Fruit at the time, but it did exist. The only thing that survived from that now is a pageant, a beauty pageant called the Queen of the Banana Queen. That's every year in the city of Machala in southern Ecuador. The only thing that survives from the Association of Banana Exporting Countries. But there have also been really interesting clubs for the procurement of life-saving technologies like medicine. There's the Central America Club for procurement of medicine, the Caribbean Club for procurement of medicine, the Mercosur Club for procurement of medicine. You know, here in the United States has been a contentious issue on food procurement and having, you know, bulk purchasing of medicine. Well, that has been also an issue, but at a regional, multi-country level in our region. In the case of Ecuador, we designed an open knowledge-based pool procurement of medicine and medical technologies that was started with this old metric of fiscal savings, but that slowly but surely has the intention and had the intention to evolve towards this new metric of collective food, health, and energy sovereignty, including industrial development. So how do you use the purchasing power of the state, and not just of one state or one government, but a multitude of them, so that together you have market power to negotiate with transnational capital and say, hey, we're going to purchase your good for the next 5 years. But the first 2 years, fine, we'll import that from abroad. But after that, we want you to set up shop here. We want a greater degree of manufacturing in our region with our performance standards so that can happen. Now, we can't hang around as Global South for the crumbs to trickle down from the system. The South needs to take bold action and move forward assertively. And that is only possible if we have actual market power in these dynamics, global dynamics. And that is only possible if we have regional or bi-regional clubs. That's what I wanted to share with you.
I hope your next presidential bid will be successful, and I look forward to seeing OMAC in action. Okay, so our next speaker is Liliana Doganova.
Okay, so thank you, Stefano, Sam, and Amy for the invitation. I was so much looking forward to coming back to Remarque, but unfortunately I had to cancel my travel due to some, let's say, unforeseen circumstances. So I want to apologize for not being with you there, and also thank you for making it possible to participate online. So my talk today will resonate with one of the 6 themes that Steph outlined yesterday, namely narratives for the day after tomorrow. And there will be also some resonance with Andrés' presentation, because one of the examples I'll be talking about is international law and investor-state dispute settlement. So I was very happy to hear about your position about this. So my talk will be based on an essay that I was invited to write for the Breakdown, which is a beautiful project led by Adrian Buller, who was chairing the first session yesterday and who may still be here in the public. I can't see the public very well, so I'm talking blindly. So the Breakdown is a project website dedicated to examining, I quote, how capitalism has both shaped and is being reshaped by the climate and ecological crisis. I'm a sociologist, and my work does not tackle capitalism as such, but rather the processes and practices that constitute capitalism. There is one process that is central in capitalism, and probably unsurprisingly, this process is called capitalization. How the logics of capitalization shape our relationship to the future is the broad question that I'm going to explore today. Historian Jonathan Levy has argued that to understand capitalism, we need to look at its root, capital. But considering capital not as a physical factor of production, but as a process, a pecuniary process, I quote, a pecuniary process of forward-looking valuation associated with investment. I'm sorry, I am occupying my son's room and he wants to enter just a second. I'm really sorry for this. I warned him that he couldn't, but well, this is. I'm sorry for this interruption. So in a similar vein, together with my colleague Fabian Muniesa from École des Mines and also other colleagues, we have attempted to understand capitalization as a peculiar mode of valuation, which is distinct from more common terms like, say, marketization or commodification. Things, we have argued, can be made valuable by being transformed into commodities, priced and exchanged on the market. However, things can also be made valuable in a different way. They can be made valuable by being transformed into capital, into assets, into objects of investment. And there is an important difference between these two modes of valuation, commodification and capitalization. And this difference lies in the temporalities that these modes of valuation espouse. The temporality of the market is the present, the instantness of the present, of the price signal. By contrast, capitalization is concerned with the future, with the flows of money that things are likely to generate as they become objects of investment. And it is precisely this future orientation that makes the process of capitalization, I think, an interesting entry point to reflect on the links between capitalism and the ecological and climate crisis. I will be talking about a few contemporary examples, including investor-state dispute settlement. But before I turn to them, I would like to move backward to one of the most illuminating definitions of the so-called principle of capitalization, as it was formulated by US economist Irving Fisher in 1996 in his book, The Nature of Capital and Income. I have some slides that I might try to share. Let me just give it a try, and if I can't make it, I won't insist.
Yeah.
Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the first slide, and it is the most dry of the slides. The other ones have images and nice examples, but I think we need to move through here just to understand what this what this logics of capitalization means. So Irving Fisher argued that capital was to be understood not as a specific kind of entity, but
could she make it full screen, possibly?
Sorry?
Could she make it full screen?
Oh, isn't it full screen?
Play the slideshow.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Is it still full screen or? No? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So Fisher argued that capital was not something like a specific kind of entity, but it was a specific relationship to time that was resolutely future-oriented. Capital, in this formulation, is anything that will produce flows of income during a certain period of time. And the value of capital in the present is determined by the value of this future income that it is likely to produce. Fisher gave the following example. It is the orchard that produces the apples, but it is the value of the future apples that produces the value of the present orchard. This fundamental principle, as he put it, entails that, I quote, the value of any article of wealth or property is dependent alone on the future, not on the past. Fisher expressed this principle of capitalization in a simple formula that you can see here, which basically states that to calculate the value of capital, and hence of anything according to his definition, you have to project the flows that it will yield in the future, in year 1, year 2, etc. Flows of future income are added up, but importantly, each of these flows is discounted. It is reduced by a factor which is called the discount rate, and which accounts for the idea that a sum of money in the future is worth less than a sum of money in the present. Economists call this the preference for the present. This mechanics of discounting means that the more something is distant in the future, the less it is worth today in terms of monetary value. Now, since the 1950s, this valuation formula has become a universal method for valuing things. Not only corporate investments, as Fisher suggested, but also public policy, nature, and human life. It has become a standard tool known under the name of DCF for discounted cash flow in firms' practices, and known under the name of CBA for cost-benefit analysis in public policy. As Jonathan Levy writes, under capitalism, the process of capitalization has become so economically prevalent that it has become conceivable as a general form of strategic action and valuation. So how does this matter today? I move here to my first example. In 2008, oil was found at the site of Ombrina Mare near the Adriatic coast in Italy. The exploration companies that had confirmed the existence of oil applied for a permit to extract it. Their drilling project aroused strong local and national opposition. There were massive environmental demonstrations in the Abruzzo region. 10 Italian regions joined forces to request a referendum against this project. In the meantime, the company that had found the oil was acquired by Rockhopper Exploration PLC. You can see its logo here on the slide. It's a UK-based oil exploration and production company. Responding to the strong opposition locally and nationally, legislative decrees were passed banning nearshore projects within a certain distance from the coastline, like precisely this one. And so in 2016, the application for the oil production concession in Ombrina Mare was rejected by the Italian government. 1 year later, in 2017, Rockhopper Exploration commenced international arbitration proceedings against the Republic of Italy in order to, as his CEO described it, I quote, protect our investment in the Ombrina Mare project and protect our shareholders' interests. In 2002, the International Tribunal, awarded Rockhopper the award of 184 million euros to be paid by the Italian government as compensation for the investment that the company, Rockhopper, had lost due to the introduction of environmental legislation. Now, what is interesting here is to ask what exactly this 184 million euro price tag represent? How was it determined? Like, Rockhopper had no oil drilling installation to dismantle. It had no workers to lay off. It had no contracts to terminate. So what was it compensated for? Well, all Rockhopper had was an expectation of the future, an expectation of tons of oil to be extracted and sums of cash flows to be generated in the future. This expectation was judged to be legitimate enough that its disappointment amounted to, I quote, expropriation, and was judged to be valuable enough that it is worth 184 million euros. Now, to arrive at this particular value, the tribunal used exactly the valuation formula that I presented in the previous slides. The rationale was the following. Because the company, Rockhopper, had used this tool, this formula, discounted cash flow, to determine the value of its investment in the Ombrina Mare oil field and decide whether it was worth investing in. This is also how the tribunal should reason to determine the compensation to be paid to Rockhopper for losing its investment. In a way, by adopting this tool, the capitalization tool, the tribunal was espousing Fisher's view of the value of capital, entirely dependent on the future, on an expectation about the future. In other words, the judge was thinking like an investor. And this is certainly what led the tribunal to discard the alternative valuations proposed by Italy. They were based, these alternative valuations, on alternatively on the costs that the company, Rockhopper, had actually incurred. And if you count the costs, you would arrive to only 2 million euros. And another valuation was proposed by Italy, was based on the price that the company had paid to acquire the exploration company in the first place. In this case, amounting to 36 million euros. So in both of these alternative valuations, the temporality was that of the past, of what had actually happened so far. And the amount in which the valuation resulted was much lower than the 184 million of the tribunal's award. So according to the court, the value of Umbrina Mare depended on the future, not on the past. But we could ask, whose future exactly? What kind of future? Whose future? The court implicitly acknowledged that the future that mattered was the one anticipated by the investor, ignoring not only the perspective of the past, as suggested by Italy in its alternative valuations, but also ignoring a host of other possible futures. In the protests that took place in Abruzzo, for instance, citizens imagined creating a national park and supporting ecotourism in the area. So that kind of possible alternative futures did not make their way into the scope of valuation. Now, there are today a lot of debates on the use of this discounted cash flow method in investor-state dispute settlement in international arbitration, well beyond this particular Umbrina Mare case. And commentators have observed that the inflation of damages based on that kind of forward-looking projections that are rooted in corporate practices presents actually a serious risk to governments' abilities to introduce policy, not least concerning the climate and environmental crisis. In other words, by committing to the future imagined by investors, expected by investors, we risk creating a regulatory chill that could jeopardize countries' clean energy futures. Now, this statement, which is shared among many commentators, raises an interesting question. What kind of futures can states oppose to investors' expectations? Now, it's interesting because when we inquire into how states engage with the future, we find actually exactly the same kinds of valuations. The name of the tool is different. We're not talking about discounted cash flow, but about cost-benefit analysis. The principle, nevertheless, is exactly the same. A policy is worth implementing if its future benefits outweigh its future costs. The future costs and benefits of public policies in this thinking, in this view, are measured in monetary terms. And they are all translated back into the present by reducing their value through a discount rate, which is called a social discount rate in this case. This discounting of the future becomes particularly problematic when it comes to valuing environmental and climate policies. And I'll give one example here, which is illustrated in the slide. The landmark Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, 2006 report for the UK government by economist Nicholas Stern, spotted precisely this problem. When assessed through the lens of cost-benefit analysis, through the lens of capitalization, ambitious climate policies become worthless propositions. Because their eventual benefits are indeed so distant in time, they become heavily discounted and can barely weigh against their initial costs, which are much more proximate in time, even though their amount is lower. So many have argued since then that such valuations will systematically favor adaptation over mitigation. The temporal profile of costs and benefits make the investment strategy of adaptation more valuable than that of mitigation. The Stern Review proposed using discount rates close to zero in order to make the future count as much as the present, arguing that, I quote, "We should treat the welfare of future generations on a par with our own." Now, the proposition to use discount rates almost equal to zero was harshly criticized by other economists, and most prominently William Nordhaus, who argued that the discount rate that determines, I quote, the efficient balance between the cost of emissions reductions today and the benefit of reduced climate change in the future, so once again, this cost-benefit weighing, should be simply the return on capital. According to Nordhaus, this return on capital was observable in the marketplace, and importantly, far higher than the low discount rates proposed by Stern. In this view, the way we value the future pertains to the inherent nature of the economy. It is not a matter of political will. It is something natural that we cannot act upon. Now, much of the debate that ensued from the so-called Stern-Nordhaus controversy focused on this problem of the level of the discount rate. But less attention has been devoted to the, let's say, the very appropriateness of the cost-benefit analysis tool itself, to the very idea that public policy should be valued in the same way capital is. The Stern review embraced explicitly the investor's conception of the future. In its view, I quote once again, mitigation must be viewed as an investment, a cost incurred now and in the coming few decades to avoid the risks of very severe consequences in the future. But can we treat the possibility of human extinction as any other cost? And more generally, we can ask, doesn't the climate and ecological crisis urge us to get rid of a view of the future as investment? A view that is interestingly shared by states and corporations whose valuation practices have been permeated by the logics of capitalization. According to the logics of capitalization, the future is the relevant temporality for action in the present. Decisions on investments to be made now are made according to the projection of the flows of costs and revenues that these investments will yield in the future. And at the same time, and there is a kind of a contradiction here, at the same time, the future is devalued. It is considered as a time less worthy than the present, as a time that has to be discounted when brought into the present. So there is a contradiction, and this is a contradiction on which I dwell in length in my book on discounting that was published a few months ago. But there is also something else that I would like to emphasize here. In this view, the future is conceived as a temporality that is radically different from the present. In the logics of capitalization, this difference is a difference of worth. The future is less worthy than the present. But we can find the same kind of separation between the present and the future elsewhere. And you can think of the notion of future generations, for example. It embodies a figure of otherness, an other for whom we struggle to force ourselves to care. And we struggle to do this precisely because this other appears as distant from us, distant in the future, and often gets depicted as different, qualitatively new, sometimes richer and smarter, sometimes more fragile, but always largely unknown. I would like to close with one last example, which comes not from Europe, but from the US. A few months ago, 18 children from the state of California filed a suit against the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I quote from their website, as you can see also on the PowerPoint. The plaintiffs claim that the Environmental Protection Agency has discriminated against them as children by discounting the economic value of their lives and their future when it decides what and how much climate pollution to allow. The case is ongoing. So it will be interesting to see what happens here. But what I want to emphasize is how this argument, this moving the focus from future generations to children, actually relies on a powerful inversion of the present-future divide. It moves from the present of future generations, which is a kind of an elusive matter of concern. It has been an elusive matter of concern, to the future of present generations, a future which is tangible because it is visibly present. It is not an expectation. It is something that we can see, we can observe, we can relate to in the present. So I think, oops. I'm just in closing out. I'll just, yeah, okay. So I think this last initiative sketches an alternative to the investor's future that has prevailed so far. And I think it hints at something. It makes us think about something, or reflect about something. It could be that our increasingly apparent inability to care for the future is intimately linked to the kind of relationship to the future that capitalism has cultivated, a relationship stuck in the mechanics of capitalization. So to go back to the conference theme, narratives for the day after tomorrow may well require breaking this relationship to the future, conditioned by capitalization, breaking this relationship down. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Liliana, for sharing with us how our understanding of the future is perhaps shaped by the capitalist system. And our last speaker is Kohei Saito.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me for this conference. And yeah, when I got this invitation, the topic was, about European future, what we're gonna do with the climate crisis, and then the subtitle was a social democratic response to the climate crisis. And I assumed that, I was expected to talk about the criticism of the social democratic responses. Basically, they don't work, they fail. And we see this, from the conversation with Andreas Mann, that we are overshooting all the boundaries and so on. So today, I try to present a very different kind of narrative of the future. And there are increasing interest in that kind of ideas. It's a very radical, heterodox ideas, because we are obviously in emergency. In the times of emergency, you cannot just do some conventional measures. You have to be much more bold. But the problem is we have different kind of competing narratives, and then some of them I find quite Eurocentric. Basically, their assumption about growth, the assumption about technological development, the assumption about abundance, and those ideas are very Eurocentric, and I don't think that can be universalized. And this is increasingly clear from the earlier presentation from Andrés, from the perspective of Asia or other global South countries. I think we need to provide a very different kind of vision. And I argue today that the degrowth communism, which is obviously very unattractive idea for many people, I assume, but I think this is the very consistent vision of the future utopia. If we take into account the scale of crisis and also the suffering and the voices of those people in the global South. So let me begin. And as I said, the situation that we are finding ourselves today is pretty much fucked up. It's just all the conventional solutions are not working, and we're just witnessing the more and more deepening of so-called polycrisis. And it's not just about climate change, but it's about war, genocide, and also inflation, and all those things are just piling up. And then our interest in climate crisis is a little bit kind of going away. But the problem is this crisis is gonna be not something that will go away automatically. It's not like a pandemic. If we, suffer a couple of years, some people die, unfortunately, but we survive, and then we can party again. And no, it's not the last crisis like the pandemic. It's gonna be the continuous one. It's called Andrés Mann again. That's a chronic emergency, and it's gonna be worse and worse in the future, because in the Anthropocene we have basically transformed the entire planet in an irreversible way. So there will be more, new pandemic, but also more abnormal weathers leading to food, water scarcity. There will be then more inflation. There will be more climate refugees, migrations, and then there will be probably more increased xenophobia, the rise of right-wing populism, the crisis of democracy. And then there will be obviously the conflicts over land, water, and other resources like minerals, and then that might lead to some kind of geopolitical tension, and then like war between China, US, or whatsoever could happen. But the point is basically when we are diving into this kind of perpetual chronic crisis, the climate collapse probably leads to some kind of the collapse of civilization, the political catastrophe. Yesterday, Duncan Kelly was talking about the condition of the politics and the condition of nature can no longer be separated. So the nature, the climate collapses, the politics collapses. We will have basically the negation of fundamental Western values of enlightenment like democracy, human rights, freedom, and peace. And then that's already we are witnessing today in Gaza and so on. But this gonna be accelerate more because we might want to have some kind of authoritarian leaders in order to save us from some kind of climate collapse and so on, right? So, I mean, we really need to fundamentally challenge the fundamental assumption about the politics and democracy and the economic system and so on. The problem is, so in such a situation of kind of emergency, many proposals, but as I said, often the case that people from the social democratic tradition talk about a little bit more higher income tax, and then why don't we know the house, tax carbon pricing. We can use better market mechanisms and so on. Maybe Green New Deal, and we have more public investment, more jobs, higher salary, and it all sounds attractive. It makes sense. It sounds realistic, and it sounds, implementable. So these talks about mission economy, Mariana Mascot, stakeholder capitalism, ethical capitalism. These are like very kind of ideas against neoliberal capitalism, at least. But the problem is they are, again, as I said in the beginning, often quite conventional in terms of the conception of growth and technology and abundance. So I doubt whether this kind of social democratic capitalism could somehow reclaim itself in the near future. Rather, we are really witnessing the degradation of those kind of values in the West. Indeed, I mean, this is understandable because we are overshooting. This is from yesterday, so I'm not repeating, but the 1.5 degrees Celsius is really no longer possible, and probably 2.0 degrees Celsius is no longer very unlikely to achieve. And this is mainly because of the US, unfortunately. These planetary boundaries are really over transgressed. And climate change is actually the easiest one because we have the solutions, we have technology that we know what we should do. But for example, the other issues, right? Biodiversity, what should we do? We don't even have a solution, but that would have much severe long-term lasting impact. So we are really in a situation of emergency. But the problem is poverty. It's not really related to today's topic directly, but inequality is also not improving at all, despite UN SDGs and so on. So I think most of us agree at least that this way of doing is insufficient and it's failing and we are overshooting. So, and then understandably, those people who suffer more, mainly in the global south, are criticizing this kind of order. So there are a lot of criticism of the Western double standards from the global south, and it seems, especially, I'm really concerned about the situation in Gaza. It seems increasingly obvious that the Western elites do not care about death and the suffering of the global South as long as their interests are secured. And this is really bad because we will have more issues in the coming decades because of climate collapse. So if we continue this kind of situation, it's going to be really terrible. That's why there are a lot of criticism against the global North. So if we take into this criticism from the global South more seriously, I think there's a necessity to provide a much more radical, self-critical, egalitarian vision of the future society. And I think the fundamental condition is this economic system of capitalism, so-called capitalism, associated with history of colonialism, imperialism, and racism, and also ecological unequal exchange. And this is something that we have to thoroughly criticize. That is why I think there are new interests in the socialist or communist or some kind of heterodox ideas. Even Thomas Piketty, he used to talk about just tax, but he now talks more about socialism. And I heard that the next book, he will talk more about eco-socialism. So I'm hoping that it's gonna take an year or so until he also endorses degrowth communism. But let's see. He is also changing. I think he's right. He's recognizing the insufficiency of the current social democratic ideas. But there are other people like Andrés Arauz who talks about war communism and the more extreme ones, and mine is degrowth communism, as you might know. But what is degrowth communism? So the basic idea is that we, in the global North, we have to really give up the idea that green growth, green capitalism is somehow possible. Because, of course, in some sense, decoupling is taking place, but the problem is not taking place sufficiently or fast enough. We have time limit. But the problem is if we invest in electric vehicles or other renewable energies, if we produce more, we have constant motivation to create growth by producing electric vehicles. It really doesn't make sense because we still do require, as Andrés says, a lot of minerals and energy and resources, and then the decoupling is becoming really slow. And the problem is also it requires a lot of extraction from the global South, and it will strengthen or reinforce some kind of ecological imperialism that will just secure the life or affluent life of the people in the global North. So this is not something that can be universalized. And this is the point by Marx Wissen and Ulrich Brandt that the imperial mode of living, the affluent life in the global North required the suffering and the sacrifice of the people and the environment somewhere else, in the global South. So if we take this structure very seriously, simply the equality is not enough. We can create maybe with a Green New Deal more jobs in the US, the car industry booms again and so on. But the problem is even if the American working class regain power, they might just buy bigger cars and fly more, and they just become more dominant super imperial power. So equality alone is no longer enough. And that requires the fundamental shift to the political strategy for the progressive forces. And that is why I bring this idea of degrowth into the socialist discussion, because it is necessary to recognize that this excessive mode of production and consumption in the global North can never be sustainable, even with the help of technologies. But this is not a negation of technology. We need a massive investment in renewable energies and electric vehicles, for example, but we also have to talk about reducing, for example, the number of cars, and we also have to then invest in other kinds of mobility like public transportation and so on and so on. But this kind of idea is very unpopular. understandably. So, for example, my favorite enemy, Matt Hoover, he is an American eco-socialist, criticized me for falling into some kind of ecological austerity. He basically says it's just for degrowth. It's just for rich people, who like to consume organic products, and it's never attractive for working class. And then he also emphasizes that in the state of emergency, like climate change, we need big technologies. Otherwise, just transition town, eco villages cannot fight against climate change. You just cannot go back to nature. I mean, that's true, but do we really need, as he says in this quote, do we really need to have nuclear fusion and so on? I seriously doubt. So there is a debate between so-called degrowth socialist camp on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is this group of eco-modernist camp who emphasize the role of technology and so on. And yesterday I was inspired by Alisa's talk. So last night I made the PowerPoint after drinking wine, very rough one. But basically the traditional socialism is for production, for productivism, and for more growth, but not really interested in ecological questions. So that's on the traditional side. The eco-modernist response at least recognize that we need green technologies, but we also need growth, right? So this comes like on this side. And then, but they, like Matt Hoover, criticize that the degrowth is basically Stone Age communism. So it's go back to nature, negation of technology. We just grow chicken by ourselves. So this is like anti-green technology and anti-growth camp. But I would say that this is a straw man argument because degrowth people never really say we should go back to Stone Age. We should rather invest, as I said, massively in renewable energies and electric vehicles, but not without pursuing the forever unlimited growth. Makes sense, right? I mean, we just also have to invest in public transportation, trains, buses, but we also have to reduce flight numbers. I guess we all fly too much, even though we are talking about climate change. So, I mean, we maybe eat too much meat, and so we have to reduce those things. That's true. But that doesn't mean that we should abandon all the iPhones and, we need Zoom. For that she can actually be going. And it's more efficient. So it's not about the negation of the technology. So this is a very simple argument, right? But then Matt Hoover somehow doesn't comprehend this. So I'm actually going to see him tomorrow with this NHK crew, and we're going to talk about it. But anyway. Too bad it's not. So. But there's one point that he also thinks that the degrowth is anti-working class, but I argue that the degrowth politics is working class friendly because degrowth is not about austerity, degrowth is not about frugality. We, of course, impose certain limits because resources are finite and we don't necessarily have to grow forever in order to satisfy our basic needs and when we build. But we rather focus more on satisfying our essential needs based on the human rights and so on. And the most efficient way is probably decommodify essential goods and services, as I said, education, transportation, medical care, water, electricity. These things must not be privatized. It must be socially owned as some kind of common goods. And if we decommodify those things, abundance is actually not a natural relationship. It's a social relationship. It's artificially, those basic goods and services, especially in the US, are made artificially scarce by commodification. So if we decommodify them and making them common goods again, so that's the basic idea of communism, according to my definition, it is able to create some kind of abundant society. It's not the abundance of material goods, it's the abundance of social relations, abundance of security and so on. So this is the public luxury that I think Degrowth society can provide. And then with this luxury, you are emancipated from the constant pressure to work and produce so much and then consume more with advertisement and so on and so on. So it will radically create a very different way of communicating with each other in the relationship to nature and so on. We can also, talk about taxing the rich and then, also ban private jets and then, ban SUVs, and these are conversations already taking place in European countries. But we can also introduce 4-day work week and introduce maximum and minimum income. And these are popular degrowth ideas that are also good for the working class. So I don't see any conflicts between the interest of socialist politics on the one hand and the environmental degrowth movements on the other hand. So if we, so I'm running out of my time. So if we sort of wrap up, summarize my point, I think it's the contrast between eco-modernism and degrowth are very helpful. I argue that eco-modernism, and including some version of Green New Deal, is the continuation of the Western imperial project. And in contrast, degrowth is a project of decolonization, giving more sovereignty and power to the global south, limiting the excessiveness of consumption and production in the global north is obviously the precondition for producing the condition of access to basic goods and services in the global south. And the eco-modernism is also tied to this very traditional idea of productivism, growth, and extraction, and then it's very masculine kind of, we make big cars kind of things. And then degrowth, in contrast, offers a more focus on sustainability, the activity of care, mutual aid, and the relation to nature. And this is often provided by eco-feminist subsistence perspective. If I use the expression by Maria Mies, and then this is, I think this focus on the reproductive labor is something that the Marxism didn't pay enough attention, and this is really important for degrowth socialism to update itself and, re-evaluate what we endorse in our society and so on. And then finally, eco-modernist technology does not realize post-scarcity economy because scarcity is not a natural relation. It is created by social relationship, which I already mentioned. So if this is the case, we don't have to maximize technologies. We need the technology, but we don't have to maximize them, because when we change our social relationship based on care, based on other kinds of non-capitalist way of relationship, post-scarcity economy based on public luxury and private sufficiency will be possible. Thank you so much.